This is the Zhiyun Crane 2 gimbal with the 5D Mark IV. This is the 24 to 105 STM Canon lens, and it does not have internal zoom, so the length of the lens changes as you zoom in and out. If you've balanced your camera on the gimbal at 24mm and then you zoom into 105, the gimbal will become unbalanced. I've added a counterweight to the gimbal that can be quickly adjusted with a ball head to rebalance the gimbal on the fly at different focal lengths. This also works for swapping lenses too. The lenses I use the most are the 24 to 105, the 100mm macro, and the 16 to 35. All of these lenses can be swapped and rebalanced by only moving the counterweight and without needing to move any of the gimbal screw adjustments. Alright, this is the 5D Mark IV on the Zhiyun Crane 2. I use the 24 to 105 image stabilized STM lens of Canon's. The reason why I use the STM lens instead of this lens, this is the f4. The reason I use the STM one for video, it's a lot quieter and smoother focusing. So if you're doing like rack focusing, it'll be a lot smoother. So the thing, some zoom lenses, like this is the 16 to 35, when you zoom this lens, the length of the lens stays the same. So it has like internal zooming. However, on these lenses, when you zoom them, the length of the zoom changes. So it affects your balance. So at 24mm, my camera's balanced, but at 105mm, it's front heavy. Now the Crane 2's motors are actually strong enough to compensate for this, so if I'm just doing a really quick shot and I just need to get something at 105mm, I know I can zoom in and let the gimbal do the heavy lifting of the lens and it'll actually work just fine. But if I'm going to do a shot longer than just a second or two, what I've done is installed a counterweight over here, and I have the camera balanced at 24mm with the weight forward, so that way when I zoom out I can just take this counterweight, move it to the back instead, and now the camera is balanced at 105mm. So this is just using the screw port on this arm. I also have the longer, this is the 1DX Mark II bracket, and I have that just because I added this quick release. So without the weight, I have to shift the camera's weight this way. So I have to loosen up this arm and push the camera over to the right. Okay, so now the problem with that is my motor hits the side. So with the camera properly balanced left and right this way, my motor hits this side. So that isn't that big of a deal if I'm doing a wedding, but when I was traveling that was a big deal because while I was walking around with it, I wanted to be able to fold this up. That gave me ability to close this. Now I stuck a piece of padded foam right on the top of this, and I actually am able to get the camera to perfectly sit in there with my padded foam, and then that gives me the ability to completely close up the gimbal. And then I just take a Velcro strap and I attach it to this bottom arm, and then when I'm traveling, when I'm not using the gimbal, I can take this strap and thread it up through here and just Velcro it to itself. Okay, so then when I was traveling, I wanted to be able to close this lens all the way up like this, and then you can just take a Velcro strap and you attach it to this bottom arm. Okay, and then anytime I was done using the gimbal, I could just take this strap, thread it up through there, and then Velcro it to itself, and it prevented this from moving around. And then when I was going to shoot, I could just undo it, and I could actually just leave that, or I could Velcro it to itself to kind of help fold up the excess. Okay, I'm going to remove this lens, and we're going to try another thing that I use a lot is the 105 millimeter. So with the 105 millimeter, there's a little bit more weight on. I've noticed that different lenses have more weight on the left and right of the lens. So this lens is leaning this way a little bit, so I'm going to actually use the counterweight to shift the weight back this way. Okay, now it's a little back heavy, so I'm going to go this. Okay, so now with this lens, I can actually just stick this weight and now in this position. Now I know in this position with this setup, if I just throw the 100 millimeter directly on the camera, I can just put the weight in this position and it's ready to go. With the other lens I use a lot with this setup is the 16 to 35. Now on the 16 to 35, the weight, it's a lighter lens, and when you go forward, it's too far forward, and when you go back, it's too far back. But luckily with this setup, you can also do vertical. So with this lens, I know that this lens goes about like here. Okay, so now this lens is ready to be used on this camera at with the same weight, and I didn't have to adjust anything. Now obviously before, you know, a little bit of adjustment might be like for instance if I use the 24 to 105, the f4, it's heavier, so in order to use this weight I do have to slide the camera back, but I'm usually not using this lens on this gimbal. I'm usually using the STM version.